But we're going to start really in that kind of very positive vein, a very practical vein that we've been talking about so far. And I'm really going to start with Shamina. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you very much for joining us. Mastercard has been really paving the way, both in terms of innovation, but also the amount of money that you're investing into sort of social good. Can you tell us a bit more about what does that look like for Mastercard, but also for the rest of the room, really, you know, some nuggets of how other businesses can really be starting to get
there? Definitely. Well, thanks for having it. It's great to be here. We have a lot of work to do with the members of Business Fight Poverty. So Payal Dalal is here, and we've agreed that we want to walk out with at least 5 new partnerships today. So if you could help Payal, then that would help us too. Very quickly, just in terms of laying out the MasterCard, how it works. So when the company went public, 10% of the stock went to create the MasterCard Foundation. Because it's connected to the stock, it's now worth $20 billion, and it focuses almost exclusively on Africa. So it's an independent entity based in Toronto, and I serve ex officio on their board. So they're completely independent from the company. The Center for Inclusive Growth, which is the thing that I run, we've been around since maybe 2014, and we basically, our remit is to leverage the assets of Mastercard, so technology, brand, data, people, money, for social impact. And being part of a company that's in 210 markets, pretty ubiquitous around the world, it's a lot of assets to leverage. And most recently, with the U.S. tax reform, the company set aside $500 million over 5 years to invest in this inclusive growth work. So I think the lesson here for us, and the thing that I'd love to work more closely with the members on, is thinking about how companies can leverage their own assets in a way that are complementary. So things like financial inclusion around credit. So we have a partnership with Unilever, for example, where these are private partnerships, by the way, that obviously impact the NGO community, but it's about leveraging the assets of 2 firms or 3 firms coming together to say, when we come together, we can solve a bigger problem. So in this instance, it's around credit access for shop owners in Kenya. Unilever has about 40,000 just in one supply chain, and so we've been working with them to help understand the data, the buying and selling patterns of the shop owners into their supply chain, to say, can we, as Mastercard, help bring in banks or formal credit options to help realize that behavior as proxy for credit. And so we've been working with the shop owners to use their patterns and with another banking partner in Kenya to allow them to get access to credit in a way at reasonable rates. So they're getting commercial credit rates like anybody else, and we've seen an increase already, and about 20% of them have had an increase in their sales. And so it's a very tangible way of impacting something at scale. So that's a partnership with Unilever we have going on. We're working with Levi's, for example, on digitizing factory worker payroll in Bangladesh, because we do see that as digitization as a pathway to financial independence. So for us, it's something we're doing. And again, Levi's has an issue with factories in Bangladesh and around the world. So we said, can we bring our assets together and say, and come together to solve a common problem? So in this instance, it's around factory workers in Bangladesh. And so we've been working with to create a wage digitization toolkit, and also working on the business side with what kinds of prepaid products, and this with Bcash and a bunch of others. So it's about bringing together ecosystems of private sector partners to have outsized influence and impact together.
Thank you, Shamina. And almost talking at the other end of finance now, I'm going to bring in Jed. Jed, you sit within the investment bank here at Barclays. How is financing really helping to to help business scale their social impact? Like, where are we on this journey?
Sure, of course. Just quick thank you for everyone attending. I've been at Barclays for 10 years and I've never seen the room this crowded, so congratulations. Luckily, as a panelist, I'm ensured a seat, otherwise I'd be with all you guys in the back. But yeah, so at Barclays, I'm leading a brand new group called Social Impact Investment Banking, which I think is the best job at the bank. But basically what I'm doing is working with companies around sustainability and social impact. And so if that is a large established corporation what I'm trying to do is help them design financing products and tools that incentivize them to improve their sustainability practices. So whether that's a green bond that can get you a lower cost of borrowing than a traditional bond, a sustainability-linked revolver where we'll give you a lower borrowing cost if you meet some sustainability targets. It's a variety of number of financing tools designed to encourage large companies to improve their sustainability practices. The second element of what I'm doing is working with early stage startup companies that have a new business or a new technology that'll drive a positive impact. And so electric vehicles are a good example, energy storage, new food and agricultural techniques, all sorts of these companies are very innovative, have a tool that'll really make a positive impact. And our role at Barclays is to really help them scale and to collaborate and use some of our relationships to help them raise capital, to advise them on strategic partnerships and help them really grow their businesses to a point where they can have a positive impact. And so it's a lot of it is using our relationships at Barclays as in the middle of investors and companies to try to help generate an impact in society.
Thank you. So you heard it here. If you want cheap borrowing, get green, and the man's a man. Corry, I'm going to bring you in now from a GSK perspective. When we were talking about, and we talked in advance of this panel a bit. And slightly swinging the sort of role of business here. I mean, you as a pharmaceutical are often brought in as a sort of part of an infrastructure development piece. You are part of a bigger puzzle of public bodies and government and various other sort of bits of funding. Can you share with me a bit, or us a bit, about how GSK plays that role, but also I think you've got a kind of bit of a kind of call to action in some respects around how business can be better used in those situations.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that in, and that lets me touch on what Rogério led with, so I have the luxury of being able to follow on him setting the stage. And I think what we heard from Mastercard and from Barclays was discussion about acting as a catalyst, whether it's funding acting as a catalyst or taking it in behavior change or different partnerships. And what GSK has realized is that our true value is leading with our science, our scientific contribution, the actual R&D into the medicines. But how do we make sure that science brings impact is part of this new global health strategy, and that is through partnerships that have end-to-end planning and then focus on what that true impact and that delivery is. So whereas in the past, partnerships have looked at each phase of either development and delivery, and each time you pass a new gate, you then look for the appropriate partnerships and those who raise their hand. And what GSK is now saying is actually we want to take a step back, and while we are promising to deliver the science, we want to have the early conversations with this vast array of partners where we have scenario planned out all of the different what-ifs. And then our partners have put up their hands and said, well, in these scenarios, this is how we will step in. So rather than losing time, losing effectiveness, and losing impact by every time you get to the next milestone saying, okay, what's next? Actually having that planned out. Now that does take, quite frankly, a lot of trust, and it takes long-term commitment. But it also then brings in that confidence that you can look at. So we have a number of experiences that we're incredibly proud of. We're incredibly proud to have brought the first malaria vaccine to the world. We're incredibly proud of working with MMV on the Vivax medicine. We're incredibly proud to be one of Gavi's largest partners. But we've learned from those relationships and from those experiences that we've lost time when things have come along that were different than we expected and we hadn't quite planned for them. Or that we said we can't plan until we know what the outcome of a trial is, or we know what the outcome of financing is. So if we have those conversations up front in a real honest discussion about who can do what, whose true value add is, then we can deliver all the way to the patient and truly transform the healthcare system.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Corry. So hopefully a few sort of calls to action to everybody in the room to join up with your seamless and upfront approach. Colin, I wanted to bring you in now. It's almost sort of quite timely in many respects because you're part of that catalyst equation. So Colin is from CDC, and as per Minister Baldwin's note earlier on, we should pummel you with as many questions as possible. So I've just got one nice question for you, and then everybody else can pummel the poor man. So Minister Baldwin already alluded to the fact that you guys have there's a big UK commitment to investment in Africa. CDC, UK is effectively International Sustainable Development Bank. What are the plans, and how are you going to get that rolling, and how can the room help?
Yeah. So these are exciting times for all of us, and I do want to thank you for inviting us again. I mean, this is one of our favorite events because, there is so much energy at this event, and I look forward to this every time I come to New York. So I don't want to presume, even though Harriet Baldwin sort of gave a brief introduction. For those of you who don't know what CDC is, it's the UK's development finance institution, which means we support businesses to create impact in our geographies, which are Africa and South Asia. And we've been doing that for about 70 years. We've always recognized that it's businesses that create impact. We can provide them capital, we can provide them advice, but it's those business owners, those entrepreneurs that are actually generating economic growth. And recently we've discovered that we're speaking a lot more with businesses in the developed world rather than businesses in the developing world. And why is that? And I think there are two things that happened that have really fundamentally changed the way that we think of our role in development impact. The first of those was the adoption of the SDGs, which businesses very quickly took up and which provide a roadmap for a variety of development impact outcomes that all of us want. And the second thing was the 2015 call to action in Addis that really put the focus on commercial businesses as the likely sources of the trillions that we need in order to achieve those SDGs. So that forced organizations like CDC to reconsider what our role is. How do we achieve the SDGs together? And the question of this entire sort of get together is, how do you scale impact? And I'm going to tell you 3 ways that we think we're going to scale impact through businesses. Number 1, better understand the impact that you have. Second, work with businesses to increase the impact that they have. And third, work with businesses to help them have impacts that they haven't thought about generating before. And let me take that apart. First of all, understand the impact that you have. And here we've tried to lead by example. Harriet Baldwin mentioned that job creation was the focus of CDC, and when I joined 6 years ago, that was our one metric. We've moved along from that. And so today, for every investment that we make, we have a development impact thesis. What is the impact we intend to achieve from making this investment? We detail that, we put it on a website, we identify metrics that will let us determine whether we had the impact that we wanted. So to all of you, if you're doing impact investing, if you're doing social investing, understand what's the impact you want to have in investment. Second of all, help businesses generate more of the impact that they're doing. And the example I'm going to use on this one is work that we did with local banks in Sierra Leone. When the Ebola crisis hit Sierra Leone, all of the financing dried up, which meant you had all of these companies that suddenly were on the verge of bankruptcy, and no bank could, because of the risk structure, be lending into Sierra Leone at that point. And we partnered with local banks and gave them guarantees that freed them to make that type of investing. We couldn't have done it ourselves. We didn't know all the businesses in Sierra Leone. They knew the businesses but couldn't provide the capital. We had the capital and risk appetite to take that risk on hand, and together we put money into those companies. So that's helping businesses that already do impact just do more of that. And then the third one is to help businesses do impact that they can't have. And there, the example I'm going to use is this innovative platform called MedAccess, which essentially does forward purchasing of health products. All right, so businesses like GSK can't develop products unless they know that there is a stable market to buy them. So what we do is upfront we say, okay, we'll buy a certain number of these products, which frees businesses like GSK to develop these innovative products. And the first one that's recently come to market is an AIDS test for sub-Saharan Africa. But we look forward to doing this in all kinds of health products, and it's been done, it was first done actually in the area of pharmaceuticals and vaccines. So that's a way of working with businesses to help them do an impact that they wouldn't have thought about at all. So those are the three ways that we're going to try and answer this challenge set to us by the government, by Harriet Baldwin, and frankly by all of you. So.
Thank you, Colin. I want to bring in Michelle now. Michelle, as the NGO in some respects on our vast panel, but also everybody's got on their tables. There's a new report that's just been launched today around the partnership that you've had with Cargill over the last 50 years. So you've been at business engagement for some time. What is the role of NGOs in this space, particularly with regards to businesses trying to scale their social impact?
Yeah, well, thank you. And I think we have some form of partnership with all of the folks on this panel. And CARE is, for those of you who don't know, is a 70-year-old organization that does development work, humanitarian work, post-World War II, and is now in 90-plus different countries. I would say that as we think about our corporate partnerships, we create a variety of different collaboratives. One is around our geographic reach and our capacity to have deep community roots which we can offer and complement the business expertise of our corporate partners. The other is we have expertise. Every nonprofit has some form of expertise that they're focused on. For CARE, it's 70-year history of development and humanitarian work, but deeply focused on women and girls. And I think increasingly companies are understanding that that is at the center of development efforts and humanitarian response. And then we also, as has been referenced here, we measure and evaluate toward scale. So we can help companies and work together to determine what is working and how do we scale that geographically and for impact. And we all know that we have a lot farther to go in order to reach the threshold. Cargill is a great example. They actually, in some ways, it's emblematic of, I think, the corporate philanthropic journey. It started in 1958, actually almost 60 years ago, with the CEO of Cargill deciding instead of giving Christmas presents, he was going to give care packages. And from that, we have grown to, for instance, having a deeply embedded partnership. 10 years ago, we launched something called the Rural Development Initiative. We have engaged impacted the lives of 2.2 million people around the world. And I think what we would point to around what has worked around that partnership is we've worked together to find the intersection of where CARE is trying to create change and also where, for instance, Cargill has both a business interest and also a broader philanthropic interest. We've also found ways of channeling their intellectual capital from their corporate CEO to their volunteers in Guatemala who are helping us to in India, activating people around food, nutrition, education for children as an example. And we've also gone to the point where we're not just doing programmatic work, we're also doing advocacy work. We're looking at systems change together because they have a reach. For instance, when we go up on Capitol Hill and talk about food aid reform, it really helps to have somebody from Cargill who's sitting there with you. And so that comprehensive piece of the equation is really key. And just to bring it to life, I think one of the most powerful programs that CARE does is a village savings and loan program. So imagine, for instance, in Ghana, where Cargill works on its supply chain, a woman named Sarah who's a smallholder farmer. She's a widow. She's in danger of losing her 2-acre farm. And CARE and Cargill worked together with her to enable her to do savings, to do training. She was able to produce 6 times as much cocoa from her farm and to be able to therefore support her family and her children. CARE wants to take that program and go from 7 million to 50 million people in our village savings and loan program. And we know the only way we'll be able to do it is through partnerships like Cargill and with other corporates.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Now, the gentleman to my right has been sat here very quietly, listening. Kuseni, I want to bring you in as the voice of reason and the man who's not necessarily having to drink the Kool-Aid of why business is such a sort of, force for social good. As the chairman and, sitting in the sort of leadership driving seat for big business, so effectively Walmart in South Africa, how much is the sort of social and environmental agenda on the top table's agenda? Like, where is it moving up the ranks? Like, how often is it talked about? Where are we at?
The social and environmental agenda is very much core to our strategy. I must start by thanking Barclays and GSK for hosting us, and thanks to you, Katie, for moderating this session. As Massmart, we're a purpose-driven company. Our purpose is to help people save money so that they can live better. We have 48,000 associates across 13 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We believe that we contribute on a day-to-day basis in the fight against poverty by expanding our business in the different markets where we operate. We believe by being there, our retail model is the most diversified in sub-Saharan Africa. We've got stores in deep rural areas, in inner city areas, and also in the posh suburbs of Johannesburg, Cape Town, Nairobi, Abuja, and Lagos, and Dar es Salaam and Kampala. And as we expand our footprint, we are able to really contribute to fighting poverty by, if we open a school in a rural area, for example, we bring economic opportunity there where there is none. We bring jobs where there is none. And we also contribute to tax revenue for governments, which assist in funding public services that are so key in some of the countries where we operate. We also believe by being part of the leading retailer in the world, we have a very strong modernizing and catalytic effect in the different economies where we play, because the focus that we have as a retailer is to look at sourcing from local suppliers. And if they supply us in Ghana, they supply us in South Africa, they've got to meet the same standard that Walmart has in Canada, in Japan, and here. And by working with them and taking them through our journey and making sure that they can meet the global standards that Walmart insists on, we play a very important role in modernizing local value chains and local supply chains. And some of the local suppliers that we've engaged with have not just supplied us in the domestic markets, they've managed to supply us offshore as well. We've assisted them to globalize their footprints. And that to us is a very, very important way in which our very core business, by its very nature, is really an important and powerful positive force for good in the fight against poverty, and also in really pushing and expanding our sustainability footprint. Coming closer to the issues that we are dealing with as a company, it is part and parcel of our strategic philosophy and focus to make sure that we contribute in the key areas of education, food security, early childhood development, infrastructure enhancement, as well as the arts. On the food security side, if I may give some live examples, we have deployed 279 mobile kitchens across underprivileged areas in South Africa, and we save 44 million meals per annum to underprivileged schools across South Africa. And on the food, that's on the food security side. On the education side, we've got a long-standing partnership with the Department of Basic Education, where we also assist in improving infrastructure in poor schools. Working with an NGO called Ripples for Good, we've managed to contribute to the renovation of 205 schools across South Africa. Working with an NGO called Hope Worldwide, we are actively involved in early childhood development across South Africa. And through our Supplier Development Fund, which we set up 6 years ago, we've managed to create 33 small and medium enterprises that have created over 3,000 jobs. Those small and medium enterprises are largely owned by young people, largely owned by women, and we've had great successes in getting those very same small and medium enterprises to create jobs, to scale up and also globalize their footprint. We've had companies, for example, that are producing noodles that are now exporting. They're producing cooler boxes. They're able to export those cooler boxes, and we've had areas of success in a number of areas. So I believe that business can and must indeed be a force for good in the fight against poverty. And what we're doing as Massmart, working together with our colleagues at Walmart, is really a sign that if we collaborate, if we partner, if we really make entrepreneurs realize the impact that they can have, we don't see ourselves as being the big brother there to help these small entrepreneurs. We see them as our partners because they assist us to simplify a complex supply chain. They also assist us to bring down the cost of logistics. They also assist our customers to enjoy the benefit of having brands that are produced locally and brands that they are familiar with, and also assist the country as a whole as they export. They generate foreign exchange earnings to the broader South African economy. So I believe that if we can be able to find creative and sustainable ways of scaling up, as we've been talking here, but beyond that, also helping small and medium enterprises globalize their footprints, especially SMEs from Africa. We've had great successes in countries such as Germany and Austria, where SMEs are able to globalize and reach out to global supply chains. We are seeing the art of the possible through the work that we have done at Massmart, and we are really encouraged by the success that we're seeing. And we believe that working with partners here across the table, across the room here, in this room, we can be able to do more and make our impact even better and higher.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. And now, as promised, that was my questions. I want to open it to the room. So if you've got a question, please pop up your hand. I think we've got some roving mics going around as well. Oh, there's a mic being flashed. So if you've got a question, keep your hand up and the mic will get to you. Really raise it up high. And I will try and take sort of 2 or 3 questions at a time to kind of keep us all moving. So who's got the mic first?
Hello, good afternoon. I'd like to ask, what is the role of supplier diversity in your journey as we go through and think through how we impact small entrepreneurs, mid-sized entrepreneurs, diverse entrepreneurs, women-owned? Because there are significant models that we've seen for the last 50 years here that have significant impact. Are we thinking about it globally?
Thank you very much, sir. We got a mic in the back.
Hello, James Sale from Save the Children. Thank you very much to the speakers. That's a really engaging panel. As has been mentioned earlier this morning, and Minister Baldwin mentioned this as well, we're not going to be able to reach or bridge the SDG financing gap unless we have innovative ways of financing development outcomes, and this involves using the private sector. The problem is that there are occasionally deals or investments that don't go well, and I point to say the Mozambique example of the tuna fishing loan that's happened there. But we do need to be using innovative mechanisms, and mechanisms such as the GFF, the Global Finance Facility, should be applauded and supported by international donors. But what I'd like to know from the panel is that how do we make sure that when there are investments in the private sector into development outcomes explicitly, that the most marginalised and the poorest are protected from any potential negative consequences of those investments?
Thank you very much. And one more. Have we got a mic to one more person, please? We've got a bunch of 3. Where's the mic gone? We'll take one more now, and don't worry, we'll get to keep your hand up if you've got a question. Fantastic. Oh, too much choice.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Dent from BioVentures for Global Health. So we've launched a program where we're looking for innovative financing with Nigeria, because Nigeria, it's hard to move funding around, particularly right now with the president trying to crack down on corruption. So we're actually trying to find a kind of a middle organization bank. We've talked to the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, to hold funding for the government of Nigeria to manage a program on access to cancer medicines. So we've done a study with the Ministry of Health on 8 cancer centers across the country and we've analyzed that they want to treat 5,073 patients that are presenting across 5 different cancer types. We've done a costing on significantly reduced prices and come up with a budget. But now I'm just wondering if any of the financing institutes have thought about kind of acting as a almost an escrow account where the government of Nigeria can put the funding in that will be guaranteed. The companies will then see that the funds are available and will be paid. And as the drugs reach the hospitals, that funding can be distributed. So that was one question. And then I also just want to comment, in Nigeria, again, getting financing is extremely challenging. And sometimes for the bigger corporations like Dangote's businesses, he can access financing from outside of Nigeria, so gets much lower interest rates compared to some of the businesses that are trying to compete with him in Nigeria. And just wondering if anyone's thought of solutions for some of the other businesses in getting lower interest rates. It sounds like everyone's thinking about that, but that's something we've heard is a disadvantage for new entrepreneurs really trying to compete against some of the really established big groups in Nigeria.
Thank you very much. So I'll take those 3, and then for the others who've got questions, don't worry, we're coming to you. So I thought, if it's okay with you, perhaps Colin, would you mind taking those final couple of questions with regards to Nigeria, and then if Michelle and Jed, would you mind taking the question with regards to the chat from Save the Children with regards to what happens to financing outcomes when they don't quite necessarily go so well. And diversity of supply chain, I was wondering whether you two would mind having a sort of a bit of a stab at how do you support that kind of supplier diversity in your journey? Perhaps, if you don't mind, Shamina, would you like to start with that?
Oh, sure. So I think it's really, it's probably much more in your bailiwick than mine.
So I'm happy to give it a go. Supply diversity, it's a crucial element of our strategy. For us, we have a deliberate policy on diversifying our supply chain, emphasizing sourcing of goods from women-owned businesses. We define female-owned businesses as businesses that are 51% and above owned by women. We also have targets that we set for our executives to deliver on those. We also have very specific and clear and deliberate targets in terms of promoting sourcing from youth-owned businesses. We also have very clear targets on that front, and these are targets that we set, and these are targets that we monitor on a constant basis. Every board meeting conversation, strategy conversation has got to do with that, as indeed local supply as well. Every market we are in, we're in 13 countries, we're in West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa. Our strategic approach is really to make sure that we localize the benefit of our economic activities as much as possible. The first port of call is to look at local suppliers. When Walmart came to South Africa, there was a huge fear that South Africa is going to be swarmed by cheap imports from China and from outside South Africa, that local suppliers are not going to have a bite at the cherry. But we've proven that wrong because we've increased local sourcing. We've created 33 businesses, most of which are female and youth-owned, and they're not just supplying in South Africa, but we're assisting them to globalize as well as accessing the global Walmart supply chain. And diversity is very much a central plank of our strategy.
So I could just jump in very quickly and say, just to complement that, so what our role here is, again, around complementary assets, is enabling the cost of all that to come down. And so we recently launched, for example, a program with Microsoft called Track, which basically is connecting every small business on the Mastercard platform with every small business on the Microsoft platform to say, can you reduce the cost of invoice payments, the back-end stuff that that small businesses need to engage with their suppliers. So, for example, as Walmart, everybody has their own process of supplying, right? So Unilever has its own process, Procter & Gamble has its own process, Walmart has its own. And so the small business on the receiving end of that has had to figure out, how do you connect the dots across all of them in a way that allows them to keep doing their business, but also even order. And so this technology, so the idea is if you digitize the back end, you can connect them in such a way that you create common protocols and common standards so that the small business on the front end isn't having to deal with 15 things behind them, but there's a unified platform that they can start to tap into that reduces the cost for everybody. So.
Thank you. So hopefully some practical tips. Jed and Michelle wanted to talk to you a bit about, how do you protect those businesses at the front end when the financing doesn't necessarily go so well? Who wants to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Far too polite.
Yeah, so it's definitely a good point, and it's something that we run into a lot. A lot of these earlier stage businesses that are really generating an impact are also fairly risky, just based on where they are in their commercialization. I'd say, first of all, I think now is as good a time as ever for these businesses to succeed, because there's so much support from both a consumer preference level, from a regulatory support and government support. These earlier stage businesses, there really seems like there's been a shift in the last 5 or 10 years that these positive impact companies are really poised to do well. It's interesting. So my group, Social Impact Banking, if you thought about, there are lots of people in traditional finance who are, you hear the word social or green and they kind of push back and they say, what are we doing? Why is Barclays have a role like this? And the answer to those groups are, these are really going to be successful companies. And so when you look at the companies that are poised to succeed over the next decade and really grow, they are the ones that are generating positive impact. And so that community is really, I think, the financial backing and the ecosystem that's being developed to support these companies is as good as it's ever been. I would say, to more directly answer your question, some of these companies won't succeed. And I think if you're an investor trying to support these businesses, you have to take a portfolio approach and recognize that, so for some of the investments you make, they won't be successful, but hopefully the ones that do succeed offset those losses. And then secondarily, I think, a lot of where these companies could get more help is from corporates and strategic partners. And it doesn't always have to be an equity investment, but whether you're willing to do a trial run or a test run, or whether you're willing to be their first customer. I think there are ways for corporations to help de-risk these businesses and create partnerships that are not necessarily equity investments, but ways that they can create joint ventures or partnerships that sort of de-risk and help those companies grow.
Thank you, Jed. Michelle?
Yeah, I think that the answer is, I think in some part, that this is a real role for nonprofits, and that by working together with nonprofits, we can help mitigate unintended consequences and also help ensure that we really are driving meaningful impact. I mean, that should be, I think, a part of what nonprofit partnerships enable in these roles. I would use CARE's example is we've actually created a continuum within the organization. We have a accelerator that's just taking programs that have the capacity to go to scale, some of which might have a revenue model, some of which might not. We then have something called CARE Social Venture Labs, which is taking programs that have some revenue model already and figuring out how do we partner with corporations and invest in them, knowing that many of them will be hybrids. I mean, I think one of the things that we have to look at is how do we support and engage those efforts that have bigger scale and higher capacity, even if they're not going to be profit making. And then the third thing that we're doing is creating an actual impact fund. And we're doing that focused in South Asia around dignified work for women with a real emphasis on impact first. We'll have modest returns, but our focus will be on impact. And I think we do have to keep pushing collectively to ensure that we are really diligent and focused on the impact so that these don't become lowest common denominator in terms of the change that we're trying to drive.
Thank you. And Colin, last of this round. How are we going to get money moving in Nigeria, and how do we create some balance in there when you've got people able to get financing in from outside if they're big?
So the Dangote question is very unique because Dangote's involvement with the refinery is so significant for the Nigerian future that he's raising money almost as a proxy for public investment. So move him to one side, generalize the question. You are right that getting local financing into the hands of small local businesses is a challenge. DFIs and IFIs usually focus on the supply side of that rather than reducing the cost of that money. Why do we do that? Because since we're talking about negative impacts, if we just drove down the interest rate that we charged, we would have an enormous negative impact by wiping out the local banking sector and dwarf the positive impact. So usually we rely on the local banks to set the price, and then we try and drive more and more supplies because it's really the supply side. Now there's one exception to that in Africa, which is local currency. So, and we know that the price of borrowing in local currency is significantly higher than borrowing in US dollars. And most local businesses can't borrow in US dollars for a variety of reasons. And we've been working very hard to see whether there are innovative products that let us reduce that basically 4x foreign exchange premium. So I'm also happy to talk to you about escrow accounts, but that's a technical question. Maybe we do that one-on-one.
You've been saved, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you, Colin. The next 3 questions, hopefully we've got the mic is back. Come on, ladies, stick your hands up nice and tall. And the gentleman in the back, of course.
Thank you very much. My name is Henrietta Kolb and I work at the International Finance Corporation. I've just come from a last event where a bunch of impact investors and PE funds came together to discuss gender lens investing. And so I'm just curious in particular with a question to maybe Jed and to Colin, how are you both thinking about, where green was probably about 15, 20 years ago, how do you tackle really a focus on gender lens investing? What does it mean? There's a lot of pinkwashing. How can we get serious about it and really make an impact that closes gender gaps? Thank you.
Thank you, Henriette.
Hello, my name is Maureen Connolly and I'm with One Earth Future. We have designed a catalyst for engaging the private sector, making a business case for peace. And I'm hearing all these wonderful examples. Is there a platform for engagement that exists? Or perhaps is this something, we're announcing it at the Private Sector Forum today as one of the commitments for the private sector to engage in making a business case for peace. But I'd love to hear from all of your relevant experience how in fact that can be most helpful in helping you scale the work you're doing. We're engaging it with a triad, the country, the NGO, and the private sector all at the same time in a convening to come up with partnerships that work. And I appreciate all this wonderful knowledge you're sharing today.
Thank you. And then I think there was a gentleman behind.
Yes, hello. Maarten Biermans from Rabobank Netherlands. Thank you again for the panel, for sharing these wonderful insights. I had a question for all the panelists. Given the fact that non-financial returns are apparently becoming more and more on the agenda, I was wondering, how does the panel feel about the notion that how do you do an account for when the non-financial returns have not been achieved? When you invest, you lose money. Okay, that happens. But when you talk about not realizing impact, or maybe even having unintentional detrimental impact, how does this go forward?
Thank you very much, sir. So I'll take those 3, and then we'll move on. So keep thinking of your questions. We're not done here. So the first one with regards to gender lens, if it's okay with you ladies, I'd love to sort of talk to you guys about how do you really create that kind of the gender lens piece as well. So Jed and Colin, you've obviously been earmarked for that one by Henriette. Sure. We've got the platform for engagement for peace and the business case that goes with that. Who would like to take? Anybody want to talk about peace? Michelle?
I'm always delighted to talk about peace, but maybe others might have.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Sorry,
and then
talk about that.
the wonderful Rabobank, who've obviously been pioneering kind of agricultural banking, and how do you create that sort of what happens when the non-financial returns aren't made? So again, I'm afraid I'm going to go back to fantastic. Thank you very much. So starting with gender lens, Jed, Colin, who wants to talk to?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So I was delighted to announce at the recent G7 a 2X initiative, which set a challenge to DFIs to mobilize $3 billion in financing for gender-focused investments by the 2020 G7. So I think you're absolutely right that gender investing is rising in importance. I do want to pause, and we're very careful not to talk about gender lens investing, because we think it's more than that. It's more than just filtering your investments. What we're focused on is actually making things better. So in the investments that we make, we try and improve the focus on gender products, improve women's roles in management, improve women's shareholdings. You know, the sort of the pinkwashing, is that what you call it? That's a good phrase. Is a real problem. And a key part of the 2X initiative is, for the first time, it sets up agreed criteria of what qualifies as a gender investment. And that, personally, I think that's one of the biggest wins from that initiative. So.
Yeah, I just would say, I think it's a good analogy in saying it's at kind of the stage green investing maybe was 10 years ago, and it has a ways to go. We, in the impact investors I speak with, whether they're private equity or venture funds, a lot of them have criteria related to gender, whether it's diversity of board or a female-led CEO or different employee programs. And so there is some focus on it and some data being compiled, but I think there's a long ways to go. And it's definitely, as Colin mentioned, an opportunity for further development. So you see the beginnings of it, and whether it's diversified impact funds, including it as a criteria, or new funds that are specifically focused on it, you've seen a little bit of that over the last couple of years, but I do hope it continues to advance and grow, because I think it would be a ripe area for improvement.
Fantastic, thank you. Michelle, turning to you with regards to platforms for peace.
In terms of your question, I do think that that there is a role obviously for the business community around this. So the invitation to participate, I think we do continue to have to build the case and also the concrete steps that business can take in order to be able to participate. Because I don't necessarily see always that business sees clearly its role for how to participate in such a thing. But if you look at, for instance, the numbers, and you look at the fact that we'll have 80% of extreme poverty in conflict fragile states, I think you start to build the global sensibility of how important this is collectively from a business perspective, but also from a national security perspective, et cetera. I mean, I would ask others on the panel to maybe, if you have ideas.
I'll jump in. Yeah, I mean, so we spoke at the Secretary General is doing a bunch of stuff around peace as part of the prioritization. And it's interesting, so we showed up and we aren't normally invited to these types of things. And so, but we talked about the role of cash in violence. And so we sort of said, look, we're a payments company. And so our view is, if you get rid of cash, you get rid of a lot of the stuff that causes volatility and shock and illegal stuff and arms movement in a marketplace. And you get kids working at jobs instead of doing something else. And so we based our work on Hernando de Soto's work when he did his study about studying the work in the Middle East around the violence there. He spent 2 years interviewing all of the people that got involved in the uprising, and overwhelmingly the reason they got involved was because of economic dissatisfaction and a dead end and seeing a dead end. It wasn't necessarily about the religion that became the manifestation, but at its core it was not seeing a path to growth and prosperity. And so we've been involved in the peace conversation, if you will, sticking to what we do best around the technology and the digitization of smoothing income volatility, and that's just been our contribution.
Peace is an indispensable prerequisite for social and political stability. Social and political stability is in turn an indispensable prerequisite for a conducive investment climate. I therefore want to argue that there is a business case for business to be involved in the peace conversation. In my previous life in the diamond mining industry, when I was working for De Beers and Anglo American, we had the issue of conflict diamonds. And we took a proactive stance to start what we called the Kimberley process, which basically certified all diamonds that were mined by De Beers across the world in terms of which mine they came from, and we could vouch that all the diamonds that ended up here were actually clean diamonds. They were not funding the war in Sierra Leone, they're not funding the war in Angola, they're not funding the war in the eastern part of the DRC. So I think the peace dividend is there to be enjoyed by business, and I think business has to proactively engage with the peace conversation and not just be passive and wait for other role players to play a part in that.
Thank you very much. Hopefully some ideas for you. And then finally, last but not least, we're just talking to the chap, nice man from the Rabobank. You know, what happens when the non-financial targets and impacts aren't reached? You know, if it's a
Well, I think first of all, I think there are a lot of different things that come into a company's calculus of what the return from doing these partnerships would be, especially for the pharmaceutical industry. It may be a pure commercial return that we're used to seeing in the launch of all new medicines, but it also could be that if doing certain partnerships can change your volumes of scale, and that could be returns. It could be a reputational return as well. I think the true balance comes when you're not just doing something just for reputation, you're doing it because it is business sustainable. And business sustainability goes, especially for GSK, far beyond just our margins and return to shareholders, but it has to have a return that makes our business sustainable, makes sense, leads to the viability of our business, which is ultimately leading to the research and discovery of new medicines. So all of this is always leading to helping the patient, whether it's helping the patient in the immediate or the long term. And the pharmaceutical industry, fortunately or unfortunately, is very used to failing. We fail every day. When you look at the numbers of what comes through and what we're putting through in the original looking at molecules to what actually becomes a medicine, we're actually far better at failing than we are at bringing a new medicine. But what we're really good at is learning from our failures. So when there is a partnership, especially in global health, when there's a development partnership, number one, you first need to learn from your failures. And so that what protects you against is a knee-jerk reaction that you're going to then pull out of that activity. So understanding that when we are partners, that there will be failures, but we want to learn from it. Understanding that when we learn from those failures, it's not a reputational issue, and our partners will not be upset when we pull out and try and do something new in a different way, and are not dinged for keeping up a partnership that's no longer working, is what's critically important. So we are there to be a partner and bring our science and bring our expertise to the process where appropriate, and when those things don't quite work, then we need to move on to a new partnership that best uses those expertise.
Thank you very much. So hopefully, interesting thoughts there. I think we've got time for literally kind of a couple more questions. So if you've got burning questions, stick your hand up. Otherwise, I've got one more for everybody. One over here. Oh, I think this is our last question from the audience. I feel like an auctioneer today.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'll start. Sorry. James Whiting from Malaria No More. Thank you. I was at a vaccines conference a couple of months back, and this whole issue of end-to-end and the long-term nature of investing in vaccines came out incredibly strongly, and it's obviously a massive challenge for companies like GSK. I was just wondering, can you give a bit more tangibility to this, and an example of how an initiative might be approached differently in the future if this were to be implemented?
Fantastic, thank you very much. And just checking, is there another question in the room? Fantastic, then I'll move on to it.
There's one
Sorry.
question.
Thanks. Hi, David Younger from Pearson. Question for Shamina and for the panel. I believe it was mentioned that access to microcredit has grown 20%, or maybe you're accessing roughly 20% of the micro retailers. Curious to know, what is the blocker to wider scale? 2 or 3 things.
Thank you very much. Fantastic. So, Corry, if you wouldn't mind taking the first one, I think it was pretty pointedly for you. Shamina, you're on second. Corry.
Sure. So I think building on what I was saying before is one of the important things that we need to do in our partnerships is always learning. And I pointed out the failures before, but also learning from those successes that we're proud of. Because usually there are things in there that went really well that we would like to redo. And there are usually actually things that we could do better next time. And if we're keeping it in James's space, because he is from the malaria world, I mentioned earlier, GSK is incredibly proud of our history in malaria. We're incredibly proud of the malaria vaccine, but we've learned lots of lessons from it. This has been over 30 years of research and development. It's included a number of partners. And what we found is that every time we got to a new gate, then we had to pull those partners together and discuss whose role was going to do what and what we were going to do in next steps. And significantly, there were times where partners' ideas changed or risk appetites changed or things didn't turn out quite as much as they had expected. And then so we either needed to look for other partners or GSK needed to step in even to a role that necessarily wasn't our expertise, but it was in our true commitment to bring the vaccine to where it is now, where it is going to be piloted with the WHO actually in Africa. So what we're going to do is we're going to take those lessons and understand it and apply it, for instance, to our work in TB. GSK now will be very strong in the TB space with 3 molecules and medicines and a vaccine that we are working on. And learning from the malaria experience where we had EMA and CHMP agreement and marketing approval, but then needed to work with the WHO to then design pilots for implementation and then think about financing at every kind of gatekeeper step won't be applicable to TB. We need to start earlier. We need to bring the partners around the table. We need to bring in other companies that are also working in TB for a pan-TB regimen. Hopefully this is also very applicable because we're about to go into the high-level meeting on TB. And really talking about kind of early R&D where we are now and proof of concept all the way to what are we talking about if we do get a pan-TB regimen? What are we talking about if we do have a TB vaccine? How are we getting them on the ground? How are we using, yes, catalyst financing as we've been talking about, but more importantly, how is that catalyst financing talking with governments about how it's going to be institutionalized financing from those governments? So not just how do we get the Nigerias to get the catalyst financing in, but how do we get the Nigerias to actually put that into their budgets? Are there now constitutional line items that there will be funding for these things so that it becomes part of actually the natural order of going forward so we can move forward. So learning from those experiences and taking every step in an end-to-end planning is what's very important.
Thank you very much, Corry. Shamina.
Yeah, so just very quickly, I loved what you said about the diamonds and this issue of provenance, and I'll get to the credit in a second. This issue of provenance is a big one, as well as delivery of medicines to the places where they need to go. And so I would just sort of offer 2 things. One, very quickly, we actually have been working with partners to sort of, and this is not for Massmart, but to sort of say, look, for donors to have faith that when they give something, the medicine is actually going to get to the place where it's supposed to go. So we've been negotiating some arrangements where can we deliver straight to pharmacy. So if you have a medicine that you have to get somewhere and a donor wants to give you money and they're worried that it's not going to get there, we've sort of said, because money moves, and can you go straight to a pharmacy versus somewhere else? And so it doesn't sound interesting or sexy, but I'm telling you how money moves is sort of the way that gets at a lot of things. So this idea of provenance and radical transparency around where things come from, it's a very similar technology of how money moves. And so if you bring those kinds of technologies to these kinds of questions, I think you start to understand how important transparency is around a lot of these things. On the credit bit, I wasn't saying necessarily that it was this partnership with Unilever where we've seen a 20% uptake in sales of the micro merchants participating in the program, because for the first time they have access to formal credit. What's usually happening is in order to have access to microfinance, which is a little bit more on the informal side, we find that they borrow from different sources and the interest rates are very high. And so it's tough to stitch together a loan to increase your budget for purchase, for example. So what we found with this program is introducing the idea of formal credit from one banking institution at reasonable interest rates has allowed them to focus on purchasing more product and selling more product. So what we've seen is a 20% increase in sales from those those micro merchants. So I guess for me, the barrier is, we all know this to be true, that the barrier is access to credit. We all hear about it, but it's like unpacking that to understand what exactly does that mean. It does credit to do what is the thing that we're sort of asking and now answering. And so what we found, at least with this particular program, it's credit in order to buy more inventory, to sell more inventory. And when you ask that very specific question, you can start to see a path that gets micro merchants access to more credit at reasonable interest rates with longer payback period.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm mindful of everybody's time. We're standing between you or sitting between you and lunch. Each of our panelists has, I've got final question to each of you. Please keep it super short, which is, what is your call to action or key takeaway for the audience? Kuseni, could I please start with you, sir? Call to action for everybody.
My call to action is that we need smart partnerships for us to fight and win the war against poverty. We also need to look at ways of creatively leveraging technology and automation in our digital era to be able to find sustainable solutions to the poverty issue. We are doing that in our business already. We've introduced omni-channel, and through that we've managed to embrace and reach out to people that were never part of our universe and ecosystem.
Thanks, sir. Jed?
I think some of the early stage companies, the entrepreneurs, have the potential to have the most impact. The pressure point I see is once they have a product or a service that works, trying to raise capital to scale it. And nobody wants to give them the money they need to build that first facility or commercialize that first plant. And so if there's ways for everyone in the group to collaborate and find help with that pressure point of really that first money to scale, that's where I think the most kind of help is needed for these companies.
Thank you, Jen.
I think it's what I started with, which is private-private partnership and leveraging complementary assets of companies to come together to achieve even more impact.
I think everyone has said partnership, and it's just the flavors of the partnership.
Yeah.
So for GSK, it's starting early, really planning end to end, and really having that frank conversation to focus on impact.
Fantastic.
So my call to action would be to the larger corporates, and it would be think of innovations to your business model that could produce more impact, and then come to us and help and let us help you put those innovations into practice.
Yeah, more nonprofit partnerships, and I would say more audacious, more willing to take risks, and more transparent with more candor, and also more longevity. The CEO of Cargill in a recent video for CARE said we commit to another 150 years. So we replay that every time we visit. But I think we do need to be thinking about these from a long-term perspective, and we need to be able to be bold in doing that. And I would last say that as we think about our impact investing efforts, I think it would be a great thing if we were just as worried about risking not meeting our impact goals as we are meeting our financial returns. And if we really held those in parallel and in tandem.
Thank you. Well, on behalf of Business Fights Poverty and everybody here, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.